The call came just as the evening sky was beginning to fade from gold to a dull shade of gray. Deputy Mark Jensen, a steady and methodical officer known for his calm presence, wasn't expecting much when his radio buzzed to life. The dispatcher mentioned vague reports from a local hunter who had noticed something strange in the Pine Hollow woods, lights flickering at odd hours and what he thought were muffled noises echoing through the trees. Wasn't the first time Jensen had heard complaints like this. Pine Hollow had a reputation for unsettling stories, but most turned out to be harmless. Campers making too much noise, kids testing their courage, or someone mistaking shadows for threats. Still, duty demanded he take the reports seriously. As he drove his patrol truck along the narrow dirt road, the tires crunching over fallen leaves, Jensen thought about how quiet Pine Hollow could be once the sun disappeared behind the ridge. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, thick with pine and oak, their branches knitting together to form a roof that blocked out the last strands of light. Even during the day, it carried a kind of heaviness, as though it wanted to keep its secrets buried. Now, with night closing in, the woods felt older, darker, and alive with secrets no one was meant to uncover. Jensen parked at the trailhead, the engine's hum fading into silence. He stepped out and breathed in the sharp scent of pine needles mixed with damp soil. The air was cool, carrying the faint whistle of wind through the branches. He checked his flashlight, testing its beam against the darkening path, then adjusted the radio at his shoulder. Everything felt routine, but there was an edge to the evening he couldn't quite name. The hunter who had called it in hadn't given much detail, just enough to stir curiosity. The deputy started down the trail, boots pressing firmly into the earth. He'd walked these paths before during training exercises, but tonight the place felt different. The rustling of animals that usually filled the forest was oddly absent. No deer darting through the brush, no squirrels chattering in the treetops, no chorus of crickets to soften the silence. Instead, each step he took seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The stillness pressed against him, and though he wouldn't admit it aloud, a small chill ran down his spine. He thought back to the missing hikers reported over the last few years. Most cases were explained away, people getting lost, accidents in the rough terrain, the forest swallowing evidence as it always did. Yet there had been whispers, rumors carried in town that something darker lingered in Pine Hollow. Families spoke of loved ones who vanished without a trace, leaving behind gear or cars but never returning. Those stories had always been pushed aside as coincidences. Still, Jensen couldn't help remembering them as he moved deeper into the shadows of the woods. The path twisted and narrowed, roots jutting out like crooked fingers. His flashlight beam slid across the undergrowth, catching glimpses of moss-covered logs and tangled vines. Occasionally, he paused, straining to listen, certain he heard something faint. The crack of a branch, the flutter of movement far off the trail. Each time, the silence closed back in, leaving only the steady sound of his breathing. He knew the wilderness well enough to respect it, but tonight it felt like the forest itself was watching, waiting for him to take another step. He pressed on, determined to find the source of the report. The sun had now completely dipped below the horizon, leaving nothing but the glow of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, a habit born of caution, but the trees looked the same no matter which way he turned. Pine Hollow had a way of disorienting even the most experienced travelers, its trails blending into one another until you lost track of direction. Jensen reminded himself to mark his position in his mind, but an unease continued to creep over him. When he reached a small clearing, he paused to take it in. The clearing looked ordinary. Fallen leaves scattered across the ground, tall grass swaying slightly in the night air. Yet something felt off. It was too neat, too empty, as though it had been stripped of life. He stood still, scanning the edges of the trees, and realized this was the kind of place where anyone could disappear without a sound. The realization settled heavily on him. Though he didn't know it yet, this step into the clearing was more than just part of his patrol. It was the first move into a hidden story that had been building in the shadows of Pine Hollow for years. Each detail around him, the silence, the empty trail, the faint traces of disturbance, was a warning. But Jensen, with his steady pace and calm determination, believed he was simply answering another call. He had no way of knowing that his presence in the wilderness that night would place him on the edge of an encounter with something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Jensen's boots sank into the damp soil as he moved beyond the clearing, his flashlight sweeping across the forest floor. The trail had grown faint, little more than a thin line of flattened earth now covered by fallen leaves, but something caught his attention almost immediately. A set of footprints pressed deep into the ground, fresher than anything else in the area. They weren't the usual patterns he'd seen from casual hikers or weekend campers. These prints were deliberate, heavy, and oddly direct, as though the person making them had a clear destination in mind. The size suggested a grown man, and the depth meant he was carrying weight or moving with unusual force. Jensen crouched down, brushing his gloved hand across one of the imprints, and noted how the edges were still sharp, not softened by rain or wind. Whoever had made them had passed through only a short while earlier. As he rose, the air shifted, carrying with it a faint odor that prickled the back of his throat. It wasn't the natural scent of soil or pine. This was something sour, almost chemical, laced with the unmistakable tang of rot. He paused, tilting his head slightly as though the air might reveal the source if he focused hard enough. Instead, the forest remained eerily quiet. He followed the tracks, his flashlight beam steady, his other hand hovering near the radio on his shoulder. The further he went, the clearer the disturbances became. Branches snapped low to the ground, as if someone had shoved through without care. Scraps of fabric dangled from a thorn bush, the threads fraying at the edges. The piece looked recent, its colors still vivid, and Jensen's pulse quickened. Rounds in. He bagged the fabric carefully, a habit drilled into him through years of routine evidence collection, though a gnawing feeling told him this was no ordinary case of a lost hiker tearing their clothing. The forest seemed to bend around these signs, like the woods themselves were trying to point him in the right direction or perhaps lead him into a trap. As he pressed deeper, the sound of his own movements became amplified. Every step, every shift of gear, every breath seemed too loud. It made him painfully aware of how vulnerable he was out here alone. He adjusted the beam of his flashlight upward once and caught sight of claw marks etched into the bark of a nearby tree. At first, he thought it was the work of an animal, but the spacing was too deliberate, too even. They were vertical slashes, controlled rather than wild, like someone testing the strength of a blade. He took a photograph with his service camera, then forced himself to continue. The smell grew stronger as he advanced, clinging to the air in waves. It reminded him of scenes he had witnessed before: road accidents, decaying animals left by hunters. But this was sharper, heavier, and unnervingly human. The deputy's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. He stopped at a patch of soil that had been disturbed, the ground turned over as though someone had dug recently. The dirt was loose, darker than the rest, and though it was partially concealed by branches, it was impossible to mistake. He bent closer, noting the faint outline of something buried beneath, though he didn't uncover. Instinct told him to wait until backup arrived, but instinct also warned that waiting might mean losing his only lead. For a moment, he stood in silence, listening. The forest gave him nothing back. No birds overhead, no insects in the underbrush, not even the creak of trees swaying in the wind. The absence of sound itself felt unnatural, as though the wilderness was holding its breath. His flashlight skimmed across the ground again, picking up more tracks leading away from the disturbed soil. They weaved deeper into Pine Hollow, pulling him further into the darkness. Jensen straightened and followed the path. With every step, the weight of realization pressed harder on him. This was no accident, no lost wanderer stumbling through the woods. The clues formed a pattern, each detail sharpening the image of someone meticulous, someone who had done this before. It was the kind of awareness that made the hairs rise along the back of his neck. The truth settled in slowly but firmly. He wasn't tracing the steps of a victim. He was walking in the shadow of a hunter. The trail twisted deeper into the trees, narrowing until it was little more than a faint impression between the roots. Jensen pushed through tangled branches, his flashlight beam sliding across layers of moss, fallen needles, and crooked trunks. The footprints he'd been following grew fainter here, as though the person who made them had slowed, moving carefully instead of rushing forward. The silence of the forest weighed heavier now, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Each step carried him further from the safety of the main path and deeper into a space that felt untouched, hidden from the world outside. It was then that he noticed a strange outline in the distance, faintly illuminated as his light cut across the shadows. At first, it looked like nothing more than a collapsed structure, maybe the remains of an old hunting shelter. But as he drew closer, the details sharpened, and he realized it was something more deliberate. A tarp had been strung between two tall pines, its edges secured with thick rope and its surface stained with patches too dark to identify at a distance. Beneath the tarp sat a collection of objects stacked neatly, as if someone had arranged them with careful purpose. Jensen stopped just at the edge of the camp, his instincts telling him not to step too close. The entire scene radiated a sense of wrongness. The beam of his flashlight moved slowly over the items scattered across the ground. What he saw made his stomach tighten. There were belongings here, but not the kind a camper would bring. A row of driver's licenses, their photographs staring back at him, lay spread out on a piece of cloth. Necklaces, rings, and bracelets were lined up beside them, some broken, others still intact. Each piece looked like it had been chosen and preserved as though someone had been collecting them. More disturbing still were the maps pinned under a heavy stone. They were old, weathered from use, but each one had markings. Circles drawn in red ink marked different locations across the wilderness. Jensen recognized some of them immediately. Places where hikers had vanished, places where searches had ended without answers. The deputy crouched carefully, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. The ground bore the impressions of someone who had spent time here, an old sleeping bag pushed against the roots of a tree, a makeshift fire pit filled with ash and charred bone fragments, a stack of canned food half buried under leaves. Nothing about this looked temporary. Whoever had built this camp had been living here for a long time, surviving off the land and staying hidden from anyone who might stumble too close. Jensen realized he was standing in the middle of a carefully constructed hideout. A chill crept over him as he considered the significance of the evidence scattered around him. This wasn't just the belongings of one lost traveler. It was a collection, a gallery of trophies taken from people who had come into these woods and never returned. Each object was a story cut short, a life erased without explanation. The maps were not random. They were a hunter's record, a guide to past successes and future plans. Jensen's pulse quickened, his training clashing with the primal fear rising in his chest. He had stumbled onto something far bigger than he was prepared for. He lifted his flashlight again and scanned the edges of the camp. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow shifting between the trees just beyond the reach of his light. His throat tightened as he froze, listening. The forest was silent, but the sense of being observed was unmistakable. He gripped the strap of his radio, ready to call for backup, but something in him hesitated. If someone was here, they already knew he had found the camp. The date carved into the maps, the careful arrangement of items, the deliberate neatness, all of it suggested someone meticulous, someone who planned their actions down to the smallest detail. Jensen forced himself to remain calm, but a cold realization pressed against his thoughts. He hadn't just discovered a hidden camp in the woods. He had stepped directly into the private world of a predator, a place never meant to be seen. Each second he lingered here felt like trespassing into something dangerous, as though the forest itself might close in and swallow him for daring to uncover its secrets. He didn't know it yet, but the man who built this camp was closer than he could imagine, watching every move from the cover of the darkness. The air around the camp was heavy, thick with the strange mix of damp earth and the lingering sourness that had followed Jensen along the trail. He stood still for a long moment, forcing himself to listen, forcing himself to breathe quietly. His flashlight beam scanned across the trees in a wide arc, but the woods swallowed the light quickly, leaving only layers of shifting shadow. Something inside him whispered that he was no longer alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct, the same instinct that told prey when a predator's eyes were fixed on them. Unseen in the cover of the trees, someone was there. The silence of the forest wasn't just the absence of animals now. It was the pause of something waiting, something watching. Jensen's training told him to stay calm, to avoid letting fear dictate his movements. But a pulse of unease ran down his spine. He was deep in Pine Hollow, far from backup, with no quick escape except the path he had come from. The hidden camp at his feet was already more than enough proof that he had stumbled onto something serious, something criminal. But the forest pressed against him with an unshakable truth: this place wasn't abandoned. Every detail he had observed earlier now pieced itself together in his mind. The fresh footprints, the disturbed soil, the fabric caught on the thorns. Whoever had made them had led him here either by chance or by design. The thought struck him that maybe he hadn't discovered the camp at all. Maybe he had been guided to it. The idea sank in with chilling weight. Jensen's flashlight caught the faint outline of another carving on a nearby tree. This one was shallow but precise, a pattern etched into the bark. It wasn't initials nor the random markings of hikers. It was a symbol, something repeated with care, perhaps a personal sign left behind like a signature. His throat tightened as he realized this was more than a campsite. It was a sanctuary. To whoever lived here, these woods weren't just shelter. They were hunting grounds. Behind him, somewhere deep in the trees, a twig snapped. Sound was faint, barely audible, but in the crushing stillness it cracked like a gunshot. Jensen turned sharply, flashlight beam cutting across the darkness, but there was nothing visible. Just the endless wall of trunks and branches. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but he didn't draw it. He didn't want to give away the depth of his fear, even though it pressed harder with every second. The silence returned again, heavier this time, as though the forest had swallowed the sound completely. The truth was dawning on him. He wasn't the hunter in this moment, he was the one being stalked. Whoever was out there had the advantage. They knew the terrain, they knew the blind spots, they knew exactly where to move without being seen. Jensen's training reminded him that hesitation could be fatal, yet rushing blindly into the woods could be just as dangerous. He needed to keep control, to collect what evidence he could, and to make it out alive. The minutes stretched, feeling longer than they were. He forced himself to document the campsite with his camera, snapping quick photographs of the licenses, the maps, the jewelry. His movements were steady, deliberate, though every sound he made seemed to echo. Each click of the camera felt like it might draw something closer from the shadows. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes fixed on him, studying, measuring, deciding. Another sound came then, not the crack of a twig this time, but the dull thud of something heavy hitting the ground. It came from the direction opposite the path he had entered. A distraction or a warning. His body tensed as his light swept across the forest, finding nothing but swaying branches. He knew in his gut that someone was out there, playing with him, gauging his reactions. The idea that the hunter might not fear him at all, that he was nothing more than an intruder to be toyed with, set his nerves on fire. The camp no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like bait. Every instinct screamed that he was standing in the center of a trap. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, adjusted the radio at his shoulder, and forced himself to retreat a step at a time. Silence followed him, pressing closer, as though whatever lurked in the darkness was gliding just beyond the edge of his light. For the first time that night, Jensen felt the fragile line between officer and prey blur. Somewhere in the blackness of Pine Hollow, the hunter had turned his full attention on him, and there was no longer any doubt. He was being studied with the same cold patience given to every victim who had vanished before. Jensen steadied his breathing as he backed away from the hidden camp, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly despite his effort to keep it steady. He had gathered enough evidence to know this was no ordinary discovery. The jewelry, the licenses, the marked maps, each one spoke of lives cut short and someone meticulous enough to record their actions. But it was the fresh carvings on the trees and the deliberate placement of items that chilled him most. This was not just the site of old crimes, it was an active den maintained with care, prepared for return. He reached for his radio, pressing the button to call in his location, but the forest swallowed the signal. Static crackled in his ear, then faded into silence. Pine Hollow's remote terrain was notorious for dead zones, and now that weakness closed around him like a trap. He was on his own. The realization dug deep, but his training forced him to stay focused. He needed to get out while he still could. As he turned toward the path he had come from, his light swept across the trunk of another tree. This one bore a carving unlike the rest. It wasn't a symbol or a random mark. It was a date. Today's date. The numbers were fresh, the edges still raw where the blade had cut. He froze, his chest tightening, as the truth sank in. The killer hadn't just been here recently. He had been here tonight. The camp wasn't abandoned, Ferelden abandoned. It had been prepared, waiting as though the officer's arrival had been anticipated. A sudden crash echoed through the forest, the sound of a rock tumbling against roots. It came from the darkness just beyond his light's reach. Jensen spun toward it, weapon now drawn, but there was nothing visible, only the endless sprawl of trees. His heart pounded, adrenaline spiking as he realized the sound hadn't been random. It was deliberate, a distraction meant to pull his focus in one direction while something else moved in another direction. Laura, he had seen such tactics before, but never in a place so isolating, so utterly unforgiving. He forced himself not to chase the noise. Instead, he began moving quickly but cautiously down the path, every sense sharpened. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a bird, not a rustle of leaves, not even the usual creak of branches in the wind. It was as if the entire forest had stopped to watch him. Every few steps he glanced back. Predator was there, he was certain, trailing him, letting him know with every sound and every silence that escape was not guaranteed. The trail seemed longer than before, each turn stretching endlessly. But at last he caught the faint metallic glint of his patrol vehicle through the trees. Relief surged, though it was laced with the grim awareness that the danger had not passed. He climbed in quickly, locking the doors, his breath fogging the glass. The forest loomed in the headlights as if daring him to stay longer. He started the engine, the sound shattering the silence, and drove away without looking back. Later, reinforcements come Pine Hollow, but the camp was gone. The tarp, the evidence, even the trophies had vanished, as though the forest had swallowed them whole. Only the carved date remained, mocking in its simplicity. Jensen would carry the weight of that night with him, knowing how close he had come. He hadn't uncovered just a crime scene. He had walked into the hunting grounds of a predator who was still out there, watching and waiting for his next step.